The era of slavery in the American South was rife with contradictions, repression, and secrets that would never be acknowledged in polite society. Among the many hidden dynamics that shaped life on plantations, one of the most complicated and disturbing was the unspoken relationships that sometimes developed between white women, particularly stepmothers, and enslaved black men. These relationships were steeped in power, control, and the forbidden, yet they flourished in the shadows of the very society that condemned them. Imagine a sprawling plantation, vast fields stretching into the distance, and the grand house standing tall against the sky. Inside, a newly married white woman, a stepmother, takes on the role of a lady of the house. Her husband, a wealthy, much older man, had been through a previous marriage, leaving behind teenage children. The stepmother's arrival into this household is met with resistance. The children of her new husband, particularly his teenage sons, are hostile. They do not view her as family, and tension fills the air. But what makes matters more complicated is an unspoken attraction. The teenage sons, despite their outward disdain, begin to feel drawn to her in a way they can't quite explain. This new stepmother is not content in her marriage. She had not married for love, but for status, wealth, and security. Her much older husband, though wealthy, could not meet her needs, not emotionally, not physically. Night after night, as he lay beside her in bed, exhausted and uninterested, she grew increasingly restless. But her desires would not find fulfillment within the walls of her marriage. The stepmother's eyes would often wander towards the fields, where enslaved men worked tirelessly under the brutal sun. These men, their bodies hardened by the relentless labor, represented something to her, something powerful, something untouchable, something forbidden. In the suffocating life of a Southern belle, where her public image demanded purity, chastity, and obedience, these men embodied her deepest, darkest fantasies. As her husband snored beside her, she would quietly slip out of bed, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and guilt. She would make her way through the house, past the sleeping quarters, and out into the night. The stars overhead provided little light as she carefully made her way towards the slave huts, her steps hurried but deliberate. The thrill of secrecy only intensified her cravings. Her actions were dangerous, not just for herself, but for the enslaved men she would soon encounter. But in that moment, nothing mattered except the need to break free from the confines of her role as a dutiful wife. Upon reaching the huts, she would approach cautiously, knowing that her presence was both unexpected and unwanted. The black men inside the huts were not there by choice. They had been ripped from their homes, their families, their lives, and forced into slavery. To them, she was not an object of desire, but a symbol of their oppressors. Yet, they had no power to refuse her advances. In the twisted dynamic of slavery, consent was irrelevant. The enslaved men had no agency, no freedom to say no. They were forced into a role that they did not choose, and the stepmother, driven by her repressed desires, took full advantage of the imbalance of power. These encounters were not about love, nor even about mutual desire. They were about power. The stepmother found in these moments a release from the societal expectations that bound her. In her own home, she was trapped, forced to play the role of a perfect wife and stepmother, her desires and needs ignored by a husband more concerned with maintaining his wealth and status. But here, in the shadows of the slave huts, she could take control. She could dominate. She could fulfill the cravings that she had been taught were shameful, sinful, and wrong. For the enslaved men, there was no escape. They were victims of a cruel system that stripped them of their humanity, their dignity, and their ability to make choices about their own bodies. They knew that refusing the advances of a white woman could lead to violence, punishment, or even death. The stepmother, too, was aware of this imbalance of power, and she used it to her advantage. In her twisted mind, these encounters were not just about satisfying her sexual desires. They were about asserting control in a world where she felt powerless. The secrecy of these late-night visits was crucial. No one could ever know what she was doing. If discovered, the consequences would be devastating. The reputation of a white woman, particularly one from the planter class, was everything. Any hint of impropriety, especially with a black man, would lead to social disgrace, ruin, and possibly even legal repercussions. But it was this very danger, this constant threat of exposure, that made the encounters even more thrilling for the stepmother. The risk of being caught heightened her excitement, adding an element of danger that made the acts even more tantalizing. By day, the stepmother played her role perfectly. She was the picture of grace, kindness, and virtue, a loving wife and stepmother, respected by her peers and admired for her beauty and refinement. But by night, she lived a double life, indulging in secret desires that would destroy her if they ever came to light. The enslaved men, too, were forced to live with this secret, knowing that their lives could be destroyed if anyone found out. They carried the weight of these encounters, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The stepmother's actions were not unique. Throughout the South, similar relationships played out in secret, hidden from the public eye but known to many. White women, trapped in loveless marriages and repressive social structures, often turned to enslaved black men as a means of asserting power and fulfilling desires that they could not express openly. These relationships were built on a foundation of inequality, coercion, and exploitation. The black men involved had no voice, no power, and no way to resist. And yet, the society that created these dynamics was blind to its own contradictions. The same men who owned slaves and controlled every aspect of plantation life turned a blind eye to the actions of their wives and stepmothers. The same women who were expected to uphold the virtues of purity and obedience were secretly breaking every rule, engaging in relationships that defied every social norm. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was a hypocrisy that few dared to confront. As the years went by, the stepmother's secret life continued. Her husband remained oblivious, his health deteriorating as he grew older and weaker. The stepmother, now fully immersed in her double life, became bolder in her actions. She no longer waited for the cover of night. She found ways to sneak away during the day, making excuses to leave the house and visit the slave huts. Her desires had become an obsession, and she was no longer able to control them. But one day, everything changed. One of the teenage sons, suspicious of his stepmother's frequent absences, decided to follow her. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. His stepmother, the woman he had once resented and even admired, was not the person he thought she was. She was a predator, using her position of power to exploit and abuse the men who had no choice but to submit to her. The son, filled with rage and disgust, confronted his stepmother. The confrontation was explosive, and in the heat of the moment, the stepmother's carefully constructed world came crashing down. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The family was shattered, the plantation thrown into chaos. The stepmother, once a respected woman of society, became a pariah, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. In the end, the story of the white stepmother and the enslaved men she exploited is a tragic reflection of the horrors of slavery. It is a story of power, control, and the devastating effects of a system built on inequality and oppression. The stepmother, like so many others, was a product of a society that valued wealth and status over human dignity. And in her quest to assert control over her own life, she destroyed the lives of those around her, leaving behind a legacy of pain, shame, and ruin. The shadowy depths of plantation life, often masked by the image of grand southern estates and genteel society, concealed far darker truths. Among these were the secret, forbidden, and morally corrupt actions of some white stepmothers during the slavery era. These women, bound by the expectations of a patriarchal society and often trapped in loveless marriages, sought escape and fulfillment in places no one would ever expect, through interactions with enslaved black men in the isolated, wretched slave quarters. Far removed from the comfortable and pristine chambers of their homes, white stepmothers would leave their beds in the dead of night, slipping away from their husbands who often couldn't or wouldn't meet their desires. What awaited them in the slave huts was not just a physical release but the satisfaction of a power dynamic they could never openly express. It was a transgression of societal boundaries in every sense, racially, morally, and sexually. The huts, located far from the main house and tucked away in the furthest corners of the plantation, were a world apart from the luxurious life these women led during the day. They were dirty, poorly ventilated, overcrowded, and suffocating, a stark contrast to the beauty and comfort the white women enjoyed. Yet, despite the filth and discomfort, the white stepmothers were willing to enter these spaces, driven by cravings that society would never allow them to acknowledge. Once inside, the power imbalance was evident. Every enslaved man in those huts belonged to the family of the stepmother. Their lives were not their own, and they were forced to submit to her whims. As the stepmother approached the huts, she would demand that the enslaved women and children leave, leaving only the black male slaves behind to face whatever she had planned for the night. These men were left with no choice but to comply, their fates entirely at the mercy of the white stepmother who, in this moment, held the ultimate power. Inside the small, overcrowded huts, the stepmother would select 2 to 5 men to remain, the others banished to wait outside in fearful anticipation. The men left inside had no choice but to obey. To refuse meant punishment, potentially death, not just for them, but for their families as well. These acts were not merely about fulfilling physical desires. They were a twisted performance of domination and control. The white stepmother was fully aware of the power she wielded over the enslaved men and used it to indulge in behaviors that would never be accepted in the light of day. The encounters were marked by coercion, not consent. The enslaved men were dehumanized, reduced to objects of the stepmother's gratification. The acts that occurred inside the huts were often brutal and sadistic, driven by the stepmother's desire for control. She didn't just seek physical satisfaction. She sought to assert her dominance over men who, in society's eyes, were inferior. The knowledge that these men had no choice but to comply only fueled her excitement. At times, the stepmother might pit the men against each other, forcing them to compete for her favor or humiliating them in a display of her power. The men had no means of escape, no agency, and no way to resist. Their suffering was not just physical but deeply psychological. Even in cases where the stepmother desired to be dominated, the power imbalance remained. The enslaved men could never truly consent, and their participation was coerced, a reflection of the deeper horrors of slavery itself. For the white stepmother, these encounters were thrilling precisely because they were forbidden. Southern society was built on rigid racial hierarchies, and any interaction between a white woman and a black man was considered taboo, if not outright dangerous. The secrecy, the danger of being caught, only heightened her desires. It was a rebellion against the suffocating norms of Southern womanhood, a rejection of the expectation that she be pure, obedient, and chaste. But it was also deeply hypocritical. By day, the stepmother portrayed herself as a paragon of virtue, upholding the values of white Southern womanhood. By night, she indulged in acts that not only violated the moral codes of her class but further dehumanized the enslaved men under her control. The enslaved men, powerless to refuse, suffered immeasurable trauma. While the stepmother viewed these encounters as an escape, a way to assert her control in a world where she felt powerless, the men were subjected to a form of sexual violence that stripped them of their humanity. Even if they appeared compliant, they were never truly free to say no. The constant threat of punishment or death loomed over them, forcing them to endure whatever the stepmother demanded. The psychological toll of these encounters was profound. For the stepmother, it may have been about control, power, and desire, but for the enslaved men, it was a nightmare from which there was no escape. The Southern society that created these dynamics turned a blind eye to such horrors. The same men who owned slaves and controlled every aspect of plantation life were often oblivious to, or willingly ignored, the actions of their wives and stepmothers. The very women who were expected to uphold the values of purity and virtue were secretly engaging in acts that defied every societal norm. The hypocrisy was staggering, yet few dared to speak of it. These relationships were kept in the dark, their secrecy carefully maintained. Exposure would have led to social disgrace, violence, and even death, particularly for the enslaved men who were caught in the middle. And yet, these encounters were not uncommon. They were a reflection of the twisted and brutal realities of slavery, where power, race, and sexual exploitation were intertwined. The white stepmothers, trapped in lives that offered them little freedom, sought control and fulfillment in the only way they knew how, by exploiting those even more powerless than themselves. But their actions left a trail of destruction. The enslaved men, already stripped of their freedom and dignity, were subjected to yet another layer of abuse, one that would leave lasting scars. As time passed, the stepmother's secret life continued, hidden from the eyes of the world but never truly forgotten by those who suffered at her hands. The enslaved men carried the weight of these encounters with them, their pain invisible but ever present. For the stepmother, the thrill of her actions may have brought temporary satisfaction, but it was built on the suffering of others. The legacy of these relationships, like so much of the history of slavery, is one of pain, exploitation, and dehumanization. In reflecting on these stories, we must confront the darker truths of history. The white stepmothers who engaged in these acts were not just seeking fulfillment, they were perpetuating a system of oppression that devastated the lives of the enslaved men forced to comply with their desires. The psychological, physical, and emotional trauma inflicted on these men was profound, a reflection of the wider horrors of slavery itself. While society may have turned a blind eye to these encounters, their impact was real, and their legacy is one that must be acknowledged. This story is not just about the actions of a few individuals, it is about the broader system of slavery that allowed such horrors to take place. The power dynamics at play, the racial hierarchies, and the sexual exploitation all served to dehumanize and destroy the lives of those who were enslaved. And while the white stepmothers may have seen these relationships as a form of rebellion or escape, for the enslaved men, they were yet another form of violence in a life already filled with unimaginable suffering.